A 6-year-old boy vanishes in a flash flood, the whole town spiraling into panic. Then, a white dog, once known as the Silent Ghost, lets out its first bark in 3 years. It bolts into the storm, leading rescuers to an unthinkable place. Beneath a flooded manhole, a faint breath. What kept it waiting there all those years? Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss our next touching and engaging episodes. The train screamed through the mountains like a metal ghost, slicing the horizon in half just as the sun dipped behind the ridge. The sky above the small town of Millhaven shimmered in gold and ash, the light playing tricks on the shadows of trees, buildings, and waiting hearts. Everything paused when the train passed. People stopped mid-sentence. Dogs pricked their ears. Children held their breath. And standing, or rather lying, just outside the old brick post office near the tracks was a shape that had become part of the scenery. A dog, but not just any dog. He was massive, at least to a 6-year-old. White, though not a bright, cheerful white. His fur was like snow that had seen too many winters dulled by time and solitude. His ears stood tall, alert, and perfectly still. His eyes were golden amber, unblinking, always fixed in the same direction. Toward the train. People called him Ghost. He never barked, never moved, never begged for food or chased cars or wagged his tail at passing kids. He just watched. Some said he was dangerous. Others said he was cursed. A few whispered he was waiting for someone, but no one remembered who, and no one dared to ask, except Ethan Miller. Ethan was 6 years old, which meant he still believed that magic could hide in plain sight. That sometimes grown-ups didn't see what mattered because they were too busy rushing from one thing to the next. His favorite toy was a tattered blue dinosaur with one button eye. He named it Captain Chomp. His favorite color was thundercloud gray, and his favorite part of the day was the walk home from school because it meant he might see him, the dog, Ghost. It had started 3 weeks ago. Ethan had just begun first grade. Every afternoon after the final bell, his mother would hold his hand and guide him down Maple Street toward the post office, where the sidewalk cracked from years of frost and neglect. And every day, at the exact same time, Ghost would be there, lying just beneath the rusted blue mailbox, staring at the tracks. At first, Ethan had been scared. The dog was big, and his silence was eerie. But something about the way he held himself so still, so composed, made Ethan curious instead of frightened. Ghost didn't look hungry. He didn't look wild. He looked like he had a purpose, a job. Mom, Ethan had asked one day, "Why does that dog always wait there?" His mom, Claire, barely glanced up from her phone. "He's probably a stray, honey. Don't get too close." "But he's not doing anything," Ethan insisted. "He's just watching." Claire didn't answer. She tugged his hand and moved him along, muttering about emails and dinner and deadlines. But Ethan couldn't stop looking back. Something about Ghost's eyes haunted him, not because they were scary, but because they looked like they knew something, like they'd seen something no one else had. That night, Ethan dreamed of trains, and eyes like twin lanterns in the dark. The next day, he asked again, "What's his name, do you think?" Claire frowned. "The dog I don't know. He doesn't belong to anyone." Ethan didn't believe that. Everyone belonged to someone. Even the lonely. Especially the lonely. He began to think about Ghost during class. During lunch. During story time, while the other kids colored dragons and unicorns. Ethan drew the post office, the tracks, and a pale dog lying beneath the mailbox, eyes locked on the distance. Ms. Ramirez pinned his drawing to the wall with a proud smile, not realizing she'd just displayed a piece of obsession. And then came the Thursday afternoon. Everything changed. It had been a rough day. Ethan had spilled milk on his pants during snack time and been teased. He'd dropped his Captain Chomp toy in a mud puddle. And his mom was late picking him up, her voice frazzled on the phone as she asked the teacher to wait with him a little longer. By the time they walked past the post office, the sky was already bleeding orange and purple. Claire was juggling a grocery bag in her buzzing phone. "Come on, Ethan, we're already behind. I need to get dinner started." But Ethan had stopped walking. "Ethan." He didn't respond. She turned and saw her son standing alone on the sidewalk, staring across the street. Ghost was there. Of course he was. In the exact same spot. In the exact same pose. As still as the stone lions in front of the town library. Except this time, something was different. Something Ethan felt before he could name it. He dropped his backpack on the ground. "Ethan," I said. "I just want to say hi," he said, already darting across the street before Claire could react. Ethan. Cars weren't a danger on that sleepy road at that hour. But Claire's heart still kicked hard as she chased after him. She stopped at the edge of the sidewalk, fear clenching her chest as she watched her son approach the massive dog. "Don't touch him," she called out. "He might be sick. He could bite." But Ghost didn't move, not an inch. Ethan slowed to a careful walk. 5 feet, 4, 3. He crouched, his small hands trembling slightly, his voice barely audible. "Hi." Ghost lifted his head, just slightly. His amber eyes met Ethan's. And then, without warning, without sound, Ghost leaned forward and licked Ethan's hand. Claire gasped. Ethan giggled. It was a soft, slow gesture. Not hungry, not wild. Just acknowledgement. Like a knight offering a bow. Like a soldier recognizing another soul. Claire reached them seconds later, grabbing Ethan's shoulder and pulling him back. "Are you crazy?" she hissed. "That dog could have. What were you thinking?" "He didn't bite me," Ethan whispered, smiling. "He's not scary, Mom. He's just sad." Ghost had returned to his original posture, silent, still eyes toward the tracks. As if the moment had never happened. Claire stared at the animal. At the thick muscles under matted fur, the jagged scar above his left eye, the way his paws were placed perfectly symmetrical. This was no wild mutt. "He licked my hand," Ethan said again, this time with wonder. Like he knew me. Claire didn't answer. She took his hand tighter than before and led him home. That night, Ethan said nothing during dinner. He poked at his spaghetti, fed some to Captain Chomp, and watched the rain slide down the kitchen window like silver snakes. In bed, he whispered into the darkness. "Ghost." He imagined the dog lying under the mailbox, watching the thunderclouds roll in, unmoving. Waiting. For what? For who? The next afternoon, Ethan refused to let his mom hold his hand. "I can walk by myself," he said. Claire raised an eyebrow. "Oh, really? Since when?" Ethan didn't answer. He just stared ahead. Ghost was there again. Of course he was. But this time, something in the air felt charged, like static before lightning, like a question begging for an answer. Ethan approached slowly, watching as Ghost's ears twitched, then settled. He stopped just a few feet away. "You remember me?" he asked quietly. Ghost blinked once. Ethan reached into his pocket and pulled out half a granola bar. He held it out, but Ghost didn't move. Just looked. "Are you waiting for someone?" Ethan asked. "Someone who used to come off the train?" Ghost tilted his head, barely. Claire called him back. He didn't move. "You can wait with me if you want," Ethan offered. "I don't mind." Ghost didn't respond. But his tail thumped once. Then again. Claire came up behind him, her voice softer this time. "Time to go, buddy." Ethan gave a tiny wave. "Bye, Ghost. I'll see you tomorrow." And for the first time in 3 years, according to the mail clerk who smoked behind the building every day at 3:15, the dog wagged his tail in return. The days that followed unfolded like a quiet ritual. Every afternoon, just after the final bell rang, through the dusty corridors of Millhaven Elementary, Ethan Miller would step out of his classroom clutching his crayon-streaked drawings and a wrinkled paper dinosaur that passed for a backpack. While most children rushed toward parents or bicycles or after-school snacks, Ethan's eyes searched for one thing, the spot under the mailbox in front of the old post office. And Ghost was there, still as sculpture, silent as snow, watching the tracks like a soldier on duty. But something had changed. Now when Ghost saw Ethan approach, there was a flicker, a glimmer in those amber eyes, a subtle shift in posture, most notably a tail thudding gently once against the ground. A signal. Recognition. Ethan didn't tell anyone what that meant to him. He didn't have to. He'd sit cross-legged on the cracked sidewalk a few feet away, his knees stained with playground grass and cafeteria ketchup, and he'd talk about everything. About how he hated math because the numbers always tried to trick him. About how Ellie Simmons said he ate glue once he didn't, but she told everyone anyway. About how Captain Chomp, his toy dinosaur, had a loose leg again, and he was thinking of giving him a cast with Scotch tape. Ghost never responded, not with sound, but his ears stayed forward. His eyes never wandered. And when Ethan leaned forward, drawing invisible stories in the dirt with a stick, Ghost inched just a little closer. It was enough. One day Ethan brought him a drawing. It showed a white dog with a blue collar. Ghost didn't wear one, but Ethan imagined he should. Next to the dog stood a small boy holding a leash made of stars. Above them, he'd drawn a train flying through clouds like a dragon. He held the picture out shyly. Ghost didn't move. So Ethan folded it, set it carefully on the concrete, and whispered, "That's for you." When he came back the next day, the drawing was gone. The wind might have taken it, or rain. Or maybe, and this was the version Ethan preferred, Ghost had eaten it to keep it close. By the end of the week, Ethan had developed a routine. He'd sneak an extra granola bar from the pantry, or sometimes a slice of turkey from his sandwich. He wrapped it in a napkin and hid it in the side pocket of his backpack. It wasn't a secret long. Claire found the crumbs first, Then the wrappers. One afternoon, as she unpacked his lunchbox and found nothing but a chewed plastic bag and what looked like a dog biscuit, she narrowed her eyes. "Ethan," she said, voice sharp as snapped ice. "Are you feeding that dog?" He hesitated. That was answer enough. "I told you to stay away from it. It's not safe. You don't know where it's been, what kind of disease it might carry, or what it's capable of." "He's not dangerous," Ethan said softly. "He's not yours," she snapped. "He could be rabid. Or worse." But Ethan just looked at her, really looked, and said, "He's just sad." It wasn't defiance. It wasn't argument. It was truth, plain and fragile and unmoving. Claire pinched the bridge of her nose, muttered something about irrational attachment, and threw the crumbs in the trash. But the next day, Ethan packed the biscuit anyway. And the day after that, word around town began to churn. In places like Millhaven, nothing stays a secret long. Not when the grocery store doubles as a coffee shop and the librarian knows how much toilet paper everyone buys. The whispers started soft, like wind under doors. "That dog's still hanging around the post office. You'd think animal control would have come by now. I heard he's been chased off 3 times. Keeps coming back. Creepy, if you ask me. Someone said he used to belong to that girl. What's her name? The one from the train. That's just town gossip. That mutt's dangerous. It's not normal for a dog to act like that." Ethan heard bits and pieces of it. He didn't fully understand what they meant, but he understood tone. And he understood fear when he saw it curl around grown-ups like smoke. But Ghost wasn't scary. He was just alone, and Ethan understood that better than anyone. Claire, on the other hand, started to watch more closely. She wasn't a paranoid parent, not by default. But something about the way Ethan talked about that dog, how his face changed when he mentioned him, the way his drawings had begun to shift from playgrounds and dinosaurs to silent white shapes staring at train tracks, it unnerved her. She began to arrive at pickup earlier. She watched from across the street as Ethan crossed the cracked sidewalk, crouched down, and spoke in that slow, honest way children reserve for things that don't interrupt. Ghost would turn his head, tilt it, move just enough to show that he knew Ethan was there, and that mattered. Claire saw it, and something in her chest twisted. Not in fear, in memory, because once, a long time ago, she'd had a dog just like that. A golden retriever named Sandy. And when her parents got divorced, when the world cracked in half and everything spilled out wrong, Sandy was the only thing that hadn't shifted. She remembered telling Sandy her secrets, her fears, how she thought the world might fall apart if she let go of anything. Sandy never answered, but Sandy never left. That was the last time Claire had cried without shame. On the porch, in Sandy's fur. And now her son was forming a bond like that, with a dog she couldn't explain, couldn't control, and definitely couldn't trust. That terrified her. One evening, as Ethan slept curled under his dinosaur blanket, Claire stood by the window, arms crossed, staring into the dusk. She could see the mailbox from here, and faintly, the shape lying beside it. Still, unmoving, patient. She wanted to believe it was harmless. But something about the dog's consistency, it defied logic. Why there? Why every day? And why had it taken to her son so quickly? The next day, Claire followed Ethan at a distance. She parked her car a few blocks down and walked, hat low, sunglasses on. She felt ridiculous, but she needed answers. She watched from behind the bakery awning as Ethan approached the dog, sat down, and pulled something from his backpack, a biscuit. He laid it gently on the sidewalk. Ghost sniffed it, but didn't eat it. Instead, he nudged it back toward Ethan with his nose. Claire's breath caught. Ghost didn't want food. He wanted company. Then Ethan began to talk. Claire couldn't hear the words, but she saw his hands move, his head tilt. She saw the way Ghost leaned closer, not too close, just enough to be part of the moment. Other people noticed too. Mrs. Pennington, the florist, paused on her way to the market. Tommy Carter from the gas station watched from his truck window. "Kid's gonna get himself bit one of these days," someone muttered. But no one intervened. Ghost didn't bark, didn't growl, didn't even stand. He just listened. As Claire walked away, she heard someone say, "That dog should have been gone by now." "Why does he keep coming back?" Another voice answered. "Maybe he's waiting for someone." That night, Claire lay awake longer than usual. She remembered the way Ethan had laughed when Ghost pushed the biscuit back, the way his voice had softened when he spoke about the dog, the way the drawing taped to the fridge Ghost with a leash made of stars seemed to shimmer differently now. And she wondered, what if the dog wasn't just a stray? What if it was more, not supernatural, not cursed, just unfinished, like a letter never delivered, a promise never kept? A soul who had waited so long silence had become his language. It started with the sound of a train, not a distant passing one like those that rattled Millhaven's rusty tracks every afternoon. This one was different, closer, louder, urgent. Ethan jolted awake, heart hammering, but when he opened his eyes, his bedroom was silent. Moonlight pooled on the floor like spilled milk. Captain Chomp lay limp beside him, one cloth leg bent at an impossible angle. He waited, breath caught in his throat, listening. Nothing, not the rumble of wheels, not the low hum of metal on metal. Just silence. But when he closed his eyes again, the train was there, and so was she, a girl. He didn't know her name, but he knew her hair was brown and curled slightly at the ends, like ribbon. She wore a coat the color of cherry candy and boots that splashed in puddles that didn't make a sound. Fog twisted around her like a scarf. She stood near the tracks, her shape half swallowed by the mist, but her face was clear. Not smiling, not scared, just waiting. And then she'd whisper, "Ghost." The name always came soft. A call, not a command. The kind of voice you used when coaxing a friend out of hiding. The dreams came again the next night, and the next. In every one, the train thundered through the gray fog, always too fast, too loud. The girl would appear near the platform, her face tilted toward the distance. She never looked at Ethan directly. Always past him, always toward the dog. Ghost was never in the dream, but somehow Ethan knew she was calling for him. Claire didn't notice at first. Ethan wasn't the type to wake her crying or crawling into her bed. He stayed quiet. He kept his dreams folded away like old letters. But they bled into his drawings. It started with a crayon sketch left on the kitchen table one morning. It showed the post office, the mailbox, the train tracks. Ghost was there as always, but this time there was someone else, a girl. She stood beside Ghost, her hand resting gently on his back. In the other, she held a leash, a bright red leash that stretched between them like a lifeline. Claire barely glanced at it as she packed Ethan's lunch. The next drawing came 2 days later, more detailed. Ghost lay beneath his mailbox. The girl stood behind him, not beside her face, hidden under a rain-soaked hood. The leash was still there, but this time it trailed off into the distance, wrapped around something Claire couldn't make out. The third drawing brought her to a full stop. She found it tucked into Ethan's backpack while cleaning out his crushed snacks and half-chewed pencils. The paper was smudged, bent at the corners, but the image was sharp. Ghost was howling, not barking, not lying still. Howling. The girl stood far off now, across the tracks, barely visible in a swirl of fog. But the leash still connected them. Taut. Stretching. Pulling. Claire sat down hard on the couch, the drawing limp in her hands. Something had shifted. This wasn't just fascination. This wasn't a boy enamored with a lonely dog. This was something else, something deeper, older, and Claire felt the chill of it in her spine. She didn't mention it to Ethan, not yet. That evening, as he colored on the floor, she watched him from the kitchen. His face was calm, focused, but his hands trembled slightly with each stroke. His tongue peeked out in concentration, and occasionally he glanced toward the window. Claire walked over slowly. "What are you drawing?" He didn't look up. "Ghost." "And the girl?" He nodded. "She lives in my dreams." Claire crouched beside him, her voice gentle. "Do you know her name?" Ethan shook his head. "She doesn't say. Just Ghost, that's all." Claire felt something cold and electric settle in her chest. The next morning, after dropping Ethan at school, she drove straight to the town library. She hadn't been there in years, not since her college essays and borrowed mystery novels. The building still smelled like paper and time. Dust floated in the morning light like tiny secrets. At the front desk sat Nora Whitmore, the town's oldest librarian. She looked like she'd been carved from mahogany and steeped in chamomile tea. Her glasses hung on a silver chain around her neck, and her fingers were permanently ink-stained. Nora, Claire said, trying to sound casual. "Can I ask you something odd?" Nora looked up slowly, then raised an eyebrow. "You'll have to be more specific. People only come in here for odd these days." Claire pulled out Ethan's drawing, the one with the fog and the leash, and slid it across the counter. Nora studied it without speaking. Her eyes narrowed. "There was a girl," Claire began, "in Ethan's dream. And his drawings. I think she's real." Nora was silent. Claire hesitated, then leaned in. "Has there ever been an accident on the tracks? Something involving a child?" That got Nora's attention. She leaned back, fingers steepled under her chin. "You mean the Thompson girl?" Claire blinked. "Who?" "Lily Thompson," Nora said softly. 3 years ago. She was 9. Cute kid, loved dogs, always wore that red coat of hers, even in spring." Claire's mouth went dry. "What happened?" Nora's voice lost its usual tartness. "Train derailment, late March. Freight train coming through too fast. Wet tracks. Slid right off near the curve by the bluff. There were only a few injuries." "But Lily?" She trailed off. Claire didn't breathe. She and her grandmother were walking home from the farmer's market. Witnesses said Lily saw a dog, hers, probably running toward the tracks. She let go of her grandma's hand, to chase after it. They never found the body. The current took her. Claire's hands were shaking. What was the dog's name? Nora thought for a moment. Echo. Big white shepherd. Very smart. Very loyal. Some said it was part rescue, part guardian angel. But after the accident, it disappeared. People assumed it ran off or she stopped. Why? Claire didn't answer. She just picked up the drawing again. A girl in a red coat. A white dog. A red leash stretched thin between them. Is there a picture of her? Claire whispered. Lily. Nora nodded. Yearbooks, newspaper archives. Come on. They moved into the back corner of the library where the dust was thicker and the silence deeper. Nora pulled out a cardboard box marked 2019 to 2020. Inside were clippings, photos, old newsletters. It didn't take long. Lily Thompson, 9 years old, 4th grade honor roll, missing since March 26th. Claire stared at the photo. Brown curls, bright eyes, a jacket the exact shade of Ethan's crayon. And in her arms, a puppy, white, alert, already attentive to her smile. Do you think he could be... The same dog, Claire asked, barely able to speak. Nora looked at her. You're not the first to wonder. That dog Ghost, people call him, he's been around since the accident. Shows up near the post office, near the tracks, same time every day. Claire swallowed hard. Nora continued quieter now. He's never taken food, never followed anyone. But he watches and waits. Claire felt the room tilt around her. Why there, she asked. Why the post office? That's where Lily and her grandmother would stop every Saturday to send letters to her dad. He was overseas. That mailbox was their spot. The words felt heavy. Claire folded the photo and drawing side by side. Why my son, she whispered. Why is he dreaming about her? Nora smiled, but it wasn't a happy smile. It was one carved from sorrow and some kind of ancient understanding. Children, she said, see what we forget to look for. Claire left the library with shaking hands and a storm gathering behind her eyes. That night, Ethan asked for 2 blankets instead of 1. Said he was cold, even though it was 70 degrees. Claire tucked him in, brushing back his hair. Did you dream again? He nodded. She waved this time, he said. But she still didn't say anything else. Just called for Ghost. Claire bit her lip. Do you think she's lost? Ethan shrugged. She's not sad. She just looks stuck. Claire stared at the window. The train passed in the distance, its whistle a lonely echo. She's looking for someone, Ethan added sleepily. And Ghost is looking for her. Claire turned back. And what about you? Ethan yawned. I think I'm just supposed to help them find each other. It wasn't the front page. It never is for stories that grow cold. But Claire found it buried in the archives on the lower half of page 7 of the Millhaven Chronicle, dated March 28, 2020. The headline read, Local girl missing after train derailment. Search continues. She stared at the grainy photo of Lily Thompson, age 9. Brown curls caught mid-skip, 1 foot in the air, like she'd been dancing when the shutter clicked. Her smile was uneven and wild, the kind that couldn't be posed. Clutched in her arms, half blurred but unmistakable, was a puppy. White. Pointed ears. Wide, alert eyes. Claire traced her finger over the dog's face. Echo, that's what Nora had called him. But in town, he was now Ghost. Claire pulled out her phone and compared it to the pictures she'd secretly taken of the dog that sat beneath the mailbox each afternoon. Same breed, same eyes. Even the same little scar above the left brow, barely visible in the newsprint, but unmistakable in person. How are you still here? She whispered to no one. She sat back in the library chair, the article trembling in her hands. It didn't make sense. If Echo had belonged to Lily and disappeared during the derailment, how had he survived? How had he found his way back? And why did he return every day to that same cracked stretch of sidewalk beneath the post office? Claire stared at the article until the words blurred. A 9-year-old girl, a lost dog, a train crash, a broken promise, and now her son. Her son who was dreaming of a girl he never knew and drawing images of a dog no one could explain. The threads were pulling taut like someone had started stitching years ago, and only now were the seams being tugged into light. That evening, Ethan sat at the kitchen table, legs swinging, coloring without speaking. His brow furrowed with concentration as he pressed hard into the paper with a red crayon. Claire stirred spaghetti on the stove, her mind spinning like the spoon in her hand. Then Ethan spoke quiet but clear. Mom. Yeah. He didn't look up. What happens if someone makes a promise? But then never comes back to keep it? The question hit her like a slap. She turned spatula in hand. What do you mean? Still coloring? Still focused? Like, if they said they'd meet you somewhere. Every day. And you waited. But they didn't come. Claire wiped her hands on a dish towel, walked over, and knelt beside him. Did someone say that to you? No, he said simply. It's just what I think about when I see Ghost. Claire felt her throat tighten. He added, I think someone made him a promise. She swallowed and didn't keep it. He nodded, eyes still on the page. She looked at what he was drawing. It was the post office again, but this time the sky was darker. Raindrops slanted down in thick, hard lines. And there, beneath the mailbox, Ghost sat soaked but still, watching, waiting. Only this time Lily was nowhere to be seen. Claire touched his hand gently. When did you see him in the rain? Ethan looked at her, confused. Yesterday, didn't you? Claire hadn't. The storm had come fast and mean around 3 p.m., dumping sheets of cold rain over the whole town. She'd stayed in her car parked near the school waiting for the downpour to ease before running in with an umbrella. But now, she saw it clearly in her mind, Ghost soaked through fur, plastered to his sides, still lying under that rusted mailbox. As if even nature couldn't convince him to move. Later that night, while Ethan slept, Claire couldn't. She paced the hallway in bare feet. The news article in one hand, a flashlight in the other. The house was too quiet. Every creak of floorboard sounded like an accusation. She couldn't shake the image, the dog in the rain, unmoving. The leash in the drawing. The red coat. The fog. The whispered name. Ghost. Outside, a soft patter began against the window. Rain again. Light but persistent. Claire walked to the kitchen and pulled the curtain aside. There he was. Even in the darkness, she could make out the silhouette. White fur stained by water. Head bowed slightly, ears alert. He sat exactly where he always did. As if there were no roof in the world that could offer better shelter than that one spot. She opened the door and stepped out barefoot, rain soaking her shoulders instantly. The street was quiet. The town was sleeping. She approached slowly. Ghost, she called softly. The dog turned his head. Just slightly. Eyes glinting in the lamplight. You knew her, didn't you? Claire whispered. Lily? No reaction, but no retreat either. You waited, she said. All this time. A moment passed. Then another. Claire knelt on the wet pavement, not caring about her dress or the chill seeping into her skin. I'm not her, she said, but maybe I can help. Ghost blinked once. His tail thumped. Just once. Then stillness. Back home, she sat dripping in the hallway, clutching the old article to her chest, heart heavy with a truth she couldn't yet name. The next day, she drove to the crash site. It wasn't marked anymore. Just a bend in the tracks, on the far side of the bluff, where weeds had grown over the wreckage of memory. But Claire remembered the photos. She'd studied them all night. In one, the old pine tree leaned at a crooked angle where the train had scraped its bark. She stood there, the wind tugging at her coat. It was quiet. Too quiet. She imagined Lily here, running, calling for echo. The train screaming toward them like a nightmare without brakes. Had she jumped, slipped? Had she pushed the dog to safety? There was no way to know. Only the dog had returned. Claire knelt in the tall grass and whispered, Why here? Why always here? A gust of wind answered, hollow and cold. That night, Ethan dreamt again. He was on the tracks. The fog was thicker now. The train louder. He covered his ears, but it pushed through anyway. And then she was there. Lily, closer this time. She looked at him, for the first time at him. You have to help him, she said. Ethan's voice caught. How? He's still waiting. For you. She didn't answer. Just pointed behind Ethan. When he turned, he saw the post office, the mailbox. Ghost-soaked, shivering eyes locked on the tracks. The train whistled again, louder. Lily's voice echoed in the fog. Bring him home. Then he woke, sobbing. Claire rushed in, gathered him into her arms. He clung to her. He's scared, Ethan whispered. He doesn't know what happened. He's still waiting for her. Claire held him tighter, rocking gently. We'll help him, she whispered. We'll figure it out. Outside, the rain picked up, and beneath the mailbox, Ghost waited. Always. It started with a warning. A gray scroll across the bottom of the television screen. A voiceover too calm for the words it spoke flashed flood advisory in effect for Millhaven County. Residents are urged to stay indoors and avoid low-lying areas. Severe thunderstorm systems moving in from the west. Claire muted the sound. Rain hammered against the windows like fists. Trees swayed violently, and the gutter above the porch had already begun to overflow. The sky had lost all color, just gradients of charcoal and bruised steel. The kind of sky that didn't blink. She turned to check on Ethan, but the couch was empty. Panic bloomed like fire in her chest. Ethan, she called louder than she meant to. She rushed to the stairs. Nothing. His room empty. Bathroom empty. The front door was unlocked. She bolted outside. The storm slapped her, instantly sheets of cold water and wind, so strong it bent her backward. Ethan, she screamed into the howl. Ethan, but her voice vanished, shredded by the storm. 20 minutes earlier, Ethan had stood by the window, forehead pressed to the glass. He'd seen Ghost soaked and still under the post office awning, eyes fixed in that eternal gaze toward the tracks. He couldn't take it anymore. The promise, the waiting, the fear in Ghost's eyes. He grabbed his raincoat, shoved his feet into rain boots, and slipped out the side door without a sound. The storm greeted him like a monster. Thunder like growls rain that stung like gravel. But he kept going. 1 block. 2. He could barely see, but he knew where Ghost would be. Because Ghost was always there. At the old post office, Ghost lifted his head. His ears twitched. The boy was coming. He stood, not instantly, but deliberately, like a soldier answering a call he hadn't heard in years. Through the haze of water and fear, Ghost saw Ethan approaching small, struggling against the wind, face pinched with cold, but determined. And then, a misstep. The sidewalk slick with moss and water. A foot twisted. A body tilted. And suddenly, Ethan was gone, vanished through an open storm drain, a scream swallowed before it could reach the air. Ghost surged forward, but it was too late. The water roared and the boy was under. Back at the house, Claire had called the police, the fire department. Every neighbor she could reach. She wasn't crying. Not yet. She was moving the kind of panic that becomes motion. Within 30 minutes, the town mobilized. People searched backyards, storm shelters, garages. Drones were launched. Flashlights swept through alleys. Names were called, but the rain blurred everything, and the clock moved too fast. It was near the old church on Maple Lane, 5 blocks from the post office, where Ghost appeared, drenched, mud-soaked, breathless, and barking. Not a growl, not a whimper. A full-throated, soul-shaking bark. People froze. Ghost hadn't barked in 3 years. Ever. But now he barked like his lungs were fire. Then he turned and ran. Stopped. Looked back. Barked again. It took a second, but someone understood. He's trying to lead us. A firefighter shouted, "Follow the dog!" They ran. Ghost led them down side streets, through puddles, past fallen branches, and overturned trash bins. He didn't hesitate. Didn't slow. Didn't stop. He veered off-road toward a cluster of drainage tunnels, stopped in front of a manhole, and barked again. Desperate, frantic, wild. They pried the lid open. Floodwater poured from the sides. "Get the harness," someone yelled. A rescuer went down. 1 minute. 2. Then I got him, he's here. A tangle of limbs, a soaked red coat, small boots. He's alive. Claire fell to her knees as they pulled Ethan from the ground, like a rebirth. His eyes fluttered. "Mama," he rasped, voice barely audible. She gathered him in her arms, sobbing now, sobbing so violently her shoulders shook. "I'm here, baby. I'm here." Ethan turned his head weakly. "Ghost," he whispered. Claire looked up, and there he was. Ghost. Silent again, soaked and still standing a few feet away under the glow of the street lamp. Watching, waiting, for confirmation. Ethan raised a shaking hand. Ghost stepped forward, touched his nose gently to Ethan's fingers, then turned and vanished into the storm. Ethan didn't speak much after the rescue. The doctors said he'd be fine, no concussion lungs, clear vitals stable. But when Claire held him close that night, tucked safe in his bed with the storm past and the machines quiet, his eyes didn't blink. They stared past her through the dark, through the walls, through time. She'd heard of trauma showing up like silence, but this wasn't silence. This was something else. "Ethan," she whispered, brushing damp curls from his forehead. "What happened down there?" His lips parted slightly, but his voice was dry, raspy. "I thought I was going to disappear." Claire blinked back tears. "But then I heard barking," he said. And I knew it was him. He turned his head, eyes meeting hers for the first time in hours. And when I saw Ghost, he looked scared. Claire stilled, scared. Ethan nodded. Not of the water, not of the dark. He was scared I wouldn't come back. Like, he paused, voice cracking. Like someone left him once and never came back. Claire sat there long after Ethan drifted to sleep, her hands folded tight, heart thudding with a truth that no longer waited in shadows. The next morning, she did something she'd never thought she'd do. She put Ghost in the car. No leash, no command. He came willingly. She looked him in the eyes, through the rearview mirror. He sat perfectly still on the seat, soaked fur now dried, but his gaze the same. Waiting, watching. Not for her, not for Ethan, for something else. They drove to Dr. Hanley's vet clinic on the edge of town. The bell chimed as she entered, Ghost padding silently behind her. The receptionist froze mid-type. That dog's been here before. Claire turned. 3 years ago. The woman nodded slowly. Brought in for shots. Belonged to a little girl, Lily something. Claire's heart thundered. Dr. Hanley emerged moments later. I'll be damned. That's Echo, isn't it? Claire couldn't answer. Her mouth was too dry. I chipped him myself, the vet muttered, already pulling gloves on. Let's see. It took less than a minute. The scanner beeped. A number blinked on the screen, matched exactly to a record labeled Echo. Owner Lily Thompson. Registered March 2nd, 2020. Status missing. Claire stared at the file, unable to breathe. It was real. It was all real. Echo, Ghost, one and the same. The dog that wouldn't stop waiting. Ethan stood outside the clinic with Ghost beside him, staring out toward the gray line of train tracks in the distance. Claire walked over, holding the printout in one hand. He's hers, she said softly. You were right. Ethan didn't smile. I already knew. Claire crouched beside him. She must have loved him a lot. Ethan nodded. I think he was the last thing she saw. They sat in silence. Ghost didn't move. Then Ethan whispered something Claire would remember for the rest of her life. If she's not coming back, maybe I can keep her promise. Claire blinked. What promise? Ethan looked up at her, the one where she said she'd meet him every day after school. He turned to Ghost. I can do that, if she can't. Ghost moved then. He stepped forward. And for the first time, not out of duty or fear or instinct, but out of recognition, he pressed his head against Ethan's shoulder. A quiet exhale, like letting go, like saying thank you. From that day on, the town noticed something change. The boy and the dog. Every morning, Ghost would wait at the bottom of the Miller porch stairs. Ethan, now always up early, raincoat or sunshine, would pat his head and whisper something only Ghost seemed to understand. They would walk to school together. No leash, no hesitation. Just two figures, one tall enough to carry a backpack, one silent and white as winter, moving in sync. In the afternoons, Ghost would return. He'd sit near the gate, always 5 minutes early, eyes on the classroom windows. No barking, no movement, just waiting. And when Ethan appeared, he'd rise slowly, tail wagging once, and they'd walk home. A new promise, a new rhythm, a new life. But there were things Claire never told anyone, like how Ghost had stopped waiting at the post office, or how Ethan stopped dreaming of the girl in red, or how one afternoon when she found another drawing folded in Ethan's math book, it didn't show fog or train tracks or sorrow. It showed a sunny day, a schoolyard, Ghost, Ethan, and a girl watching from behind a tree, smiling. No leash, no fog, just light, and goodbye. It started with a knock. Firm, too firm. Claire opened the door to find a man in his late 40s, standing on the porch, drenched in cologne and arrogance. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a military buzz cut that hadn't aged well. His shirt was tucked too tight into his jeans, and a scar ran along his jawline like a stitched lie. Can I help you? She asked warily. The man's eyes slid past her, toward the yard, toward the figure curled in the grass near the swing set. That's him, isn't it? He said. Excuse me, the dog? He stepped forward slightly. Name's Echo, my stepdaughter's. Been looking for him a long time. Claire blocked the door. And you are Kyle Thompson. The name hit her like a stone dropped in a still lake. Ripples of unease spread instantly. Lily's stepfather, she said slowly. Was, until she disappeared. He didn't flinch, didn't soften. Claire felt her spine lock. Ghost stood up from the grass and moved behind her without a sound. Kyle smiled. Well, look at that. Still remembers me. Guess he knows who he belongs to. You don't belong here, Claire said, steel rising in her voice. Kyle cocked his head. Ma'am, with all due respect, that's my property. Microchip confirms it, and I'm here to reclaim what's mine. Claire didn't blink. You're not taking him. He smiled again, colder now. We'll see. He turned and walked down the steps, calm as a rattlesnake in the sun. That night, Claire stayed up researching. Newspaper articles, police reports, online forums filled with whispers and speculation. The name Kyle Thompson kept surfacing like oil on water. She found a thread dated April 2020, only a month after Lily's disappearance. Why hasn't Kyle been arrested? Everyone in town knew they fought. Lily told her teachers she was scared of him. No proof, they said. No body, no charges. But he sold the house a week later and vanished. Claire's hands trembled as she read the final comment. Someone needs to find that dog. Echo saw everything. Ethan heard the argument. He wasn't supposed to. He'd been curled up on the stairs pretending to sleep when Claire whispered furiously into the phone to someone. Maybe the sheriff, maybe the vet, about Kyle and the microchip and Ghost's future. He has no right, she hissed. He was investigated, yes. I know he wasn't convicted, but something about him isn't right. I know it. Ethan sat up, eyes wide. He couldn't let them take Ghost. Not now, not ever. So before dawn, he slipped out. Again, this time with a backpack full of peanut butter crackers, a flashlight, a blanket. Ghost followed without a word, like he always did. The forest wrapped around them like an old coat, familiar, but fraying. Ethan had been here once during a school field trip. But this felt different now. The trees were taller, the light darker. Even the wind moved like it was hiding something. They hiked deep. Past the trail, past the signs, past the places people usually went. Ghost never led. He followed, letting Ethan decide. Finally, they reached a clearing, a place where the trees bowed in toward each other, and the earth smelled of moss and forgotten things. They sat. For a long while, neither of them moved, until something caught Ethan's eye. Buried in the undergrowth, half covered in damp leaves and earth, was a piece of red fabric. He tugged it gently, heart racing. It came loose, a frayed leash, faded red, snapped clean through. Beside it, almost hidden in the dirt, was a small rusted tag. Ethan picked it up, hands trembling. He wiped it on his sleeve. The engraving was faint, but still visible. Lily T. His breath caught. He looked at Ghost. Ghost didn't move, but his ears tilted slightly. And for the first time, Ethan saw something break open in those golden eyes. A flicker, recognition, pain, memory. Is this where it happened? Ethan whispered. Ghost stepped forward, nose to the leash, then to the tag, then back to Ethan. He sat, not like a dog, like a witness, a sentinel. Ethan clutched the leash to his chest and cried. The woods weren't quiet anymore. Branches cracked beneath fast-moving feet. Leaves whipped past in blurs. The flashlight Ethan carried bounced wildly, casting frantic shadows as he ran, breath tight and shallow. Behind him, the voice he feared most rose again. Ethan, Kyle shouted, furious, closer now. Stop running, you little brat. Ghost stayed between Ethan and the sound, his low growl never stopping, vibrating like a war drum. Every time Ethan stumbled, Ghost nudged him forward. Every time a twig snapped too close, Ghost paused, head-turned eyes burning through the dark. They weren't far from the clearing where the red leash had been found, and Kyle was gaining. An hour earlier, Claire had walked into Ethan's room and found the bed cold, the window cracked open, and the flashlight gone. The scream that tore out of her throat wasn't even a word. She ran, called the police. This time they didn't hesitate. They'd already reopened Lily's file. The leash, the tag. A new forensic test showed faint traces of blood embedded in the fibers, old but human. This wasn't just a missing dog anymore. This was a crime scene. And Kyle Thompson had a history. Now they had probable cause. Back in the forest, Kyle's voice twisted into a growl of its own. You don't know what that dog saw, he shouted through the trees. You think he remembers anything? He's a damn animal. He pushed through a thicket of branches emerging into the clearing and stopped. There stood Ethan, alone, the leash in his hand, the tag clenched in his fist. Facing him, Kyle sneered. Give me the dog. Now. No, Ethan said, voice trembling but clear. You hurt her. I didn't hurt anyone, Kyle snapped, stepping closer. He remembers, Ethan said, tears forming. He never left. Kyle's mouth twitched. You don't know what you're talking about. Behind Ethan, a rustle, a low growl. Kyle's eyes shifted. Ghost emerged from the brush, head low, muscles taut, but not barking, not lunging, just watching, judging. You're gonna regret this, Kyle snarled, lunging forward. Ethan screamed, but before Kyle's hand could grab him, Ghost exploded. No warning, just a flash of white fur teeth and fury. He slammed into Kyle's chest with the force of a freight train, knocking him backward into the mud. Kyle howled, arms flailing. Ghost clamped down on his wrist, sharp teeth piercing fabric and skin. Kyle punched, kicked, screamed. But Ghost didn't release. Not until Ethan shouted, stop! Ghost paused, panting, still, blood dripping from his mouth. Kyle writhed on the ground, cradling his arm, face twisted in pain and rage. Then, red and blue lights strobed through the trees. Voices, police hands in the air, flashlights, boots, guns drawn. Claire barreled into the clearing moments later, pushing through officers with raw panic in her eyes. Ethan, he turned just in time for her to fall to her knees and crush him in her arms. I'm okay, he whispered into her shoulder. Ghost saved me. The sheriff stepped forward. Mr. Kyle Thompson, you are under arrest for obstruction of justice and suspicion of involvement in the disappearance of Lily Thompson. You have the right to remain silent. Kyle didn't argue. Not this time. As they cuffed him, one of the officers carefully picked up the red leash and the rusted tag Ethan had dropped. He slipped them into an evidence bag and nodded. This is enough to reopen everything. Claire held Ethan tighter. Ghost stood nearby, silent again, bloody, bruised, but proud. A ghost no longer. The dreams returned, not with fear, not with the cold, breathless panic they once carried. Now they came soft as fog on a summer morning. Ethan stood on a field of yellow wildflowers. The sky above was streaked with purples and oranges, the kind of colors that existed only in dreams or old oil paintings. The train tracks curved behind him, stretching to the horizon like silver thread. And she was there, Lily. Her brown hair blew gently in the breeze, tied back with a red ribbon. She wore a dress that shimmered like memory. Her eyes, those same eyes from Ethan's drawings, held none of the fear from before. Only peace, and something deeper. Gratitude. Hi, Ethan whispered. Hi, she smiled. Ghost stood beside him in the dream, not tense, not alert. Just still, as if he knew this wasn't a place to guard, but a place to release. Lily stepped closer. I was afraid he'd never stop waiting, she said. Ethan's eyes filled. He didn't. She looked down, holding something in her hands. It was the red leash. But in the dream, it wasn't torn, it wasn't dirty or faded. It was glowing, warm, soft. He's yours now, she said, gently offering it. But it was yours, Ethan whispered. She shook her head. I'm free now. You helped me remember love. He helped me remember trust. She placed the leash in his hands. It's a promise, she said. Keep it. And just like that, she was gone. The flowers swayed. The wind carried no more ghosts, just light. Ethan woke up holding his blanket like it was something sacred. And when he looked to the foot of his bed, Ghost was there, head resting on his paws, eyes open, watching him. Only this time, it wasn't sadness in those eyes. It was relief. The town changed in small ways. They fixed the old bell tower at City Hall, cleaned the broken benches near the post office, hung a new sign above the schoolyard gate that read, Lily's Path, walk with kindness. And every morning Ghost still walked Ethan to school. He no longer stopped at the post office. But sometimes, only sometimes, when the 3:17 train roared through the mountains, he would pause, lift his head, and listen, not waiting, not hoping, just remembering. A silent salute to the girl who once kept her promise, even in death. Claire took to writing again. At first it was just to quiet her mind. Notes, lists. The kind of thoughts that came during sleepless nights and vanished with the sun. But then the pages kept filling. She wrote about Ethan, about Ghost, about the leash, the man who almost took everything, the girl who never got to grow old, and the justice that arrived just late enough to hurt, but early enough to heal. Her working title, What the Dog Knew. But the deeper she wrote, the more she understood it wasn't really about the crime. It was about survival, about how people, even children, even dogs, carried weight heavier than words, how waiting could become purpose, and how love, even in silence, never really vanished. It just waited for someone to listen. The questions never left, not for Claire, not for Ethan, and not for Ghost. What happened after Lily vanished? Where had she gone? What secrets had the earth kept buried under the whistle of passing trains and the whispers of grief? The sheriff reopened the investigation, not because of a tip, not because of pressure from media or families, but because of a child's drawing. Because Ethan, in quiet sessions with a counselor, began to describe piece by piece fragments of memory he could not have lived but somehow felt. Images so specific, so vivid, they defied logic. There's a bend in the tracks, he whispered once, tracing a curve with his finger on a crayon map. And a tree with 3 trunks. She's there. I think she's been waiting. Ghost was beside him the entire time. Still, attentive, like he remembered too. Search teams began again. Not with helicopters or searchlights, but with reverence. They combed the area described slowly, gently, as if the ground itself had become sacred. It didn't take long. Near an old rail switch under a tree with 3 gnarled trunks grown into one another, like braided sorrow, they found the remains. Tattered fabric, tiny shoes, and bones barely touched by time. A small tag in the soil, rusted and scratched by wind and rain. Lily T. There was no doubt now. Lily had never left Millhaven. She had been waiting all along. The funeral was held on a gray-blue Sunday morning when the sky wept just enough to feel sincere. Not an event of spectacle or sorrow, but of release. The church was full. But the loudest voices were silent. The townspeople who had once judged, once assumed, once let their hearts harden against the unknown. They came with heads bowed, with red ribbons in their pockets. Ethan sat in the front pew, dressed in a dark suit, slightly too big for his growing frame. He held his mother's hand with one, and in the other, Ghost's leash. Red, not the original. That one had been buried with Lily. But a new one sewn from fabric gifted by neighbors, crafted by Claire's own hands. A symbol, a promise renewed. Ghost sat beside Ethan, his body still but his ears flicking at every sound. Not restless, not nervous, just present, as if this moment, this gathering of grief and gratitude, belonged to him as much as to any human. When the minister spoke Lily's name, Ghost lifted his head. When they read Ethan's letter to her, "Dear Lily, thank you for letting me be the one who kept the promise." Ghost exhaled, eyes closing briefly. And when the casket was lowered small and white beneath a rain-soaked canopy, Ghost didn't look away, not even once. After the service, people approached cautiously. They didn't come with questions anymore. They came with ribbons. One by one, quietly, gently, they knelt before Ghost and tied red handkerchiefs and scraps of fabric around his neck. Florence the florist, who once chased him from her garden, kissed his muzzle and whispered, "I'm sorry." Sheriff Daniels, the man who once called Ghost a straggler, fastened a ribbon and said, "You did more than we ever did." The mayor called him a guardian of the innocent. The children of the town called him Ghost the Brave, but Ethan called him something else. When they finally walked home together that evening through puddles and wind-tossed leaves, Ethan stopped on the sidewalk and looked at him. "You're not a ghost anymore," he said softly. "You're the keeper." Ghost wagged his tail. Once, the red ribbons danced against his fur like flames. He had waited 3 years, but now waiting was over. Now he walked forward. With Ethan, with purpose, with peace, and with a promise kept. It started with a question during morning announcements. "Shouldn't we do something for the dog?" A 5th grader had asked it. Loud, innocent, heartfelt. The principal paused. The teachers looked around. And the next day, the entire school voted unanimously. 2 weeks later, the town unveiled a new monument just outside the old post office. The same cracked steps where Ghost had once waited for hours, days, years. They cleared the weeds, planted lilies, set polished stone beneath a steel plaque engraved with a simple line, "To the one who waited and never left." Ghost, guardian, friend, promise keeper. No fanfare. Just townspeople standing still. Many with red ribbons in their hands, some wiping eyes they didn't expect to. Ethan, now 7, stood beside Ghost as they cut the ribbon. Ghost sat quietly as always. But when Ethan whispered, "This is for you," and Lily, Ghost leaned in, pressing his head softly against the boy's knee. It wasn't applause he needed, it was peace, and now he had it. In Mrs. Warner's second-grade class, Ethan was asked to present a hero story. He stood in front of the chalkboard, holding a drawing he'd made of Ghost standing in the rain. "This is my best friend," he began. "His name used to be Echo. Then people called him Ghost. But really, he's just the one who kept waiting." The class leaned in silent. Ethan told them about Lily, about the leash, the dreams, the rescue. He didn't make it scary. He made it true. "He didn't bark for 3 years," Ethan said. "Not once. Until the day I needed him." When he finished, several kids raised their hands. Not to ask questions, but to say thank you. The next morning, the teacher found a pile of notes in the class mailbox. "Thank you, Ghost, for saving Ethan. Dear Ghost, I love dogs and I love you. If I ever get lost, I hope you find me too." Ethan brought the letters home, read them aloud to Ghost under the old elm in the backyard. Ghost didn't wag his tail anymore. His joints ached. His legs stiffened after long naps. Gray threaded through his white fur like winter's quiet return. But when Ethan read the words, his eyes shone. Still alert, still proud, still home. Claire sat by the window of her study. Fingers paused over her keyboard. The manuscript was almost finished. She had rewritten the final chapter 3 times. First with sorrow, then with justice, now finally with grace. The dog who waited by the tracks wasn't just a story about a missing child or a loyal companion. It was a story about memory, about the spaces between the living and the lost, and how a boy, a dog, and a promise could become a bridge across time. She ended the final paragraph with a line that had lived in her mind for weeks. "Some souls don't speak in words, they wait. And if we're lucky, we hear them in the silence." She hit save and cried, not out of sadness, but out of release. Evenings were quieter now. Ghost didn't run. He didn't chase birds or squirrels. But he still insisted on walking Ethan to the front gate each morning. Still sat there at 3:17 p.m. sharp, head tilted toward the sound of the train, until Ethan returned. Neighbors waved. Some brought biscuits. One day, a woman left a red scarf draped over the fence post. Another left a child's drawing of Ghost with wings. Time moved on. But Ghost, he stayed. Not because he had to. Because he chose to. And Ethan, now taller, wiser heart, marked by things most adults couldn't fathom, chose him back. Every single day. The rain began sometime after midnight. Not a storm, just a hush. A whispering kind of rain that made the rooftops breathe and the trees sway gently, like old men remembering a song. Ethan stirred in his sleep. He wasn't sure why he woke, but when he glanced toward the window, he saw him. Ghost, sitting beneath the porch light, gazing down the road toward the old post office. His fur damp with dew, his ears twitching softly. Ethan rubbed his eyes. Slipped out of bed barefoot. Didn't even put on his coat. He opened the door and stepped into the night, heart beating with something he didn't yet have words for. Ghost didn't move when he approached, just turned his head slowly and looked at him. That look one Ethan had known since their first meeting. A gaze full of everything no one else ever noticed. History, loyalty, love. Ethan sat beside him in the wet silence. "I had a dream again," he said, voice small. She was laughing this time. Ghost blinked, exhaled. They sat together for a long time, until the wind picked up, until the street lamps flickered. And then for the first and final time, Ghost stood, walked down the gravel road. No leash, no child to follow, no train to wait for. Just a slow, steady gait, as if every step was part of a song he remembered. He reached the boulder outside the old post office, turned, and looked back. Ethan, standing alone in the rain, raised his hand. "Good night, Ghost." Ghost didn't bark, didn't whine, just lowered his head once, then lay down under the wooden bench where Lily used to wait, and closed his eyes. Morning came too bright. The rain had left everything glassy and still. Claire was making breakfast when she saw Ethan standing beneath the elm tree, out back unmoving. She knew. No words. Just a mother's instinct that reached beyond time. When she stepped outside, Ethan turned. His cheeks were wet, but not from the rain. "He didn't come to the door," he said. Claire knelt, heart splintering. "Where is he, baby?" Ethan pointed. They walked together, hand in hand. To the place under the elm. To the mound of stillness, wrapped in fur and silence. Ghost lay curled like he was sleeping, eyes shut, muzzle tucked beneath his tail. The red leash was beside him. But Ethan didn't cry. Not yet. He reached into his pocket, pulled out the worn strip of leather, the same leash Lily once gave him in that dream. He knelt beside Ghost, lips trembling. "Hey, buddy," he whispered. "You did it." He gently laid the leash across Ghost's chest. "Rest now. I kept the promise." The town heard within hours. Before sundown, candles flickered along the post office steps. Children brought drawings, letters, treats Ghost used to love but hadn't eaten in months. The mayor ordered the flag at City Hall lowered. Florence from the flower shop donated hundreds of lilies. Sheriff Daniels came in uniform, his badge polished, and placed his own ribbon red, embroidered with the town's crest next to Ghost's paw. And that evening, under a sky of pastel orange and aching blue Millhaven, held its first ever memorial for a dog. Not just a dog, the dog. A protector, a keeper, a friend. Ethan was asked to say a few words. He stood at the small wooden podium, too short for the mic, but no one minded. He didn't read from paper. He didn't need to. He waited a long time, Ethan said. Longer than most people would. But he never forgot. He never gave up. He looked at the gathered faces. Men and women, old and young, all silent. He saved me, Ethan continued. Not just from the flood, from being afraid, from forgetting. His hand rested on this wooden box that held Ghost's collar. I think some promises are so strong they stay even when the person is gone. Ghost showed me how to keep one. He paused, swallowed. Goodbye, Ghost. You waited long enough. And as if on cue, the 317 train passed by. The whistle sang through the hills. And everyone turned toward the sound. Heads lifted, eyes damp, and hearts full. Spring came back to Millhaven with a gentleness it hadn't known in years. The snow had melted into memory. The streets sang with birdsong again. Wildflowers bloomed along the old train tracks as if nature itself remembered. Exactly 1 year had passed since Ghost's final walk beneath the elm. And in that time, Ethan had grown. His legs were longer, his voice more certain. He had learned to tie his own shoes and to walk a little slower. Not because he had to, but because it reminded him of Ghost's old pace. And today, on this bright, breeze-touched morning, he had someone new by his side. A puppy, clumsy, big-pawed, cream-furred with ears that still didn't know which way to flop. They named her Clover because she'd been found curled in a patch of them on the edge of town. Because she was a reminder that some luck comes softly and some love comes back, not the same, but enough. Ethan held the leash loosely in his hand as he and Claire strolled through town. The leash was red, not the old one, not Lily's, but a new one. Sewn from the same fabric that had once rested across Ghost's chest. A symbol, a continuation. They turned the corner near the post office. Ethan stopped. Claire paused with him, her eyes softening. In front of the old building where weeds once grew and loneliness once waited, stood a new statue, bronze, weather-kissed. It showed a little girl, Lily, smiling with her hand resting on the head of a German shepherd. His posture proud, his eyes watching something far away, eternal. Ghost. Between them, a leash hung loose, not tethered, not restraining, but connecting, and beneath them, etched into stone, love never dies. It just passes from one hand to another. Ethan reached out and touched the cool bronze fur. Hi, Ghost, he whispered. Clover barked once, not understanding, but sensing the reverence. Claire stood back, giving her son space. This was his moment, his bridge between what was and what would be. After a quiet pause, Ethan looked up at the statue's face. I kept my promise, he said softly, then turned to Clover. And now it's your turn. The puppy wagged her tail tongue, flopping out with a goofy grin. Ethan chuckled. She's not as quiet as you, he admitted to the statue. But I think you'd like her. Claire stepped beside him. I know he does, she said. They sat together on the bench nearby, the same one where Ghost had once rested. Waiting for trains no one else noticed, Claire pulled out a small hardcover book from her tote. The Dog Who Waited by the Tracks, by Claire Miller. The cover showed a white shepherd, silhouetted beneath a train trestle at dusk. She handed it to Ethan. You should read it at school, she said. You said you'd tell everyone. Ethan smiled, hugging the book to his chest. I will. Then he looked at the sky, at the clouds, moving slowly across blue. Maybe they'll tell it too, he added. The ones who never got to say goodbye. Claire brushed his hair back. You've got a big heart, baby. Ethan shrugged. Ghost showed me how. They stayed until the wind picked up, until Clover started chasing a butterfly near the steps, until the shadows stretched toward evening. As they stood to leave, Ethan turned one last time. He raised his hand. Goodbye again, Ghost. He paused. No, not goodbye. Just thank you. And with that, he walked forward, leash in hand. New story beginning. Old love carried. Always remembered.